All right, we can kick it off. Well, good day, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to our second webinar for the BioTool Innovator Accelerator. I'm Ayelet Morom. I'm the program director for the BioTool Innovator program. Our program was built to support life science tools and diagnostics companies that are developing technologies to improve human health. And our weekly webinar series features leading voices in our industry that provide unique insights and guidance for our companies and beyond. Today's topic is a very relevant one for all life sciences tools companies and diagnostic companies, and we're going to discuss strategic partnerships. A few quick reminders just before I hand it off to Catherine to start the discussion. You should all be prompted with an entry survey. Please respond to the survey before starting the webinar, and you will also be prompted with a quick exit survey after the webinar. We're also live streaming this on YouTube for the first 60 minutes, and then we'll follow up with a 30-minute private chat for our cohort companies where you get the chance to ask our panelists some of your questions. You can post your questions then on the Q&A box and we'll promote you to ask the question live. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Catherine, our host for today. Catherine is the Managing Director of BioTools Innovator and COO of MedTech Innovators. So Catherine, go ahead.
Excellent. Thank you, Ayelet, for that nice intro. So I want to welcome our panelists today with a really excellent group of panelists who have incredible experience across the industry. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce each of them. So let's start with Charlie from Danaher. If you could tell us a little bit about yourself and how you found your way into life science tools.
Great. Well, pleasure to be here. I'm Charlie Patel. I'm with Danaher. I was a founder of the Danaher Innovation Center, which is our corporate venture arm, which was started about 4 years ago. I've spent my entire career in the biotech industry, spanning about 30 years and working across a breadth of different industries, from industrial enzymes to more bioinformatic companies to biopharmaceutical companies, pivoting from small molecules or gene therapy rather into solids. And then a long stint in really more the tools space, starting with Applied Biosystems, which became part of Life Technologies. And part of that was acquired into Danaher. We're Danaher now. About five of those years have been spent in the M&A group. I've spent a few years heading up business development and strategy for a couple of different operating companies within Danaher, before again starting the Innovation Center 4 years ago. The majority of my background has been in more transactional roles, whether it's business development and licensing, M&A, or more recently, corporate venture investing.
Thank you for that intro, Charlie. Next, let's move over to Patrick from MilPoR-Sigma.
Hello, everybody. So I'm Patrick Schneider, head of strategy, business development, and innovation for the research solutions business of MilPoR-Sigma. And thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel group. I'm excited to hear from all the other panelists and to hear from people about various topics that are on their mind. I've spent about 25 years in the life science tool industry, starting with a small company that was an antibody company called Chemicon. And then that was acquired by Serologicals, which was acquired by MilPoR, which was acquired by Merck KGaA, Darmstadt, Germany. And so certainly a journey through acquisitions from small companies to large companies, and played multiple roles, throughout that 25-year journey, running businesses in business development and in R&D, and now I'm also the executive sponsor for our Life Science Innovation Board. So I've had a lot of transactional experience from all types of transactions, M&A through to licensing and various acquisition of various technologies. So again, happy to be here. Thanks.
We're happy to have you, Patrick. And our last panelist today is John from Thermo Fisher Scientific.
Yes, I'm Don Kakuda. I'm from Thermo Fisher Scientific. Thank you again for inviting me to this panel. Looking forward to it. I'm based in our Carlsbad site, which is just north of San Diego. Been with Thermo Fisher now just over 6 years as a business development director. My main focus is bringing in technologies in relation to cell biology area. That could be technologies including gene and cell and gene therapy applications, media compositions, cell culture workflows, cell culture plastics. Essentially, a lot of the tools, I guess, that are used in life sciences. So that's where I've been spending, I guess, most of my time in the past 6 years or so. Really is in that tool space. Before that, I worked in tech transfer. I was at UC San Diego's office for a few years. And before that, I spent some time down in Australia at the University of Queensland at UniQuest. At the UniQuest site down there, we had a business model of spinning out several university startups each year. So part of my role there was not only out licensing technology, but also seeking initial funding for these small startups. So I think I can relate to some of the startups that are part of this panel, perhaps, and in other groups that you work with. Really trying to engage with either strategic partners or literally looking for that first seed round and some of the challenges that go with that. So that's a bit of time spent there and understanding that kind of part of the field. On the technology side, I got my doctorate over at UC San Diego in the Cancer Center. So my technical background is also in biology, cell biology, and my intellectual property background is from back in Australia again. I'm a registered Australian patent and New Zealand patent attorney. So a little bit of intellectual property background there. So between those, I guess that experience has kind of led me to where I'm at now, working at Thermo Fisher.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Don, also for being here. We have obviously an incredible, great group of panelists, and we'll just dive right into the questions. You guys mentioned a couple times M&A, licensing. So I'm curious to hear how each of your companies engages with early stage startups. If there's an investment arm, describing that. And then maybe, kind of a follow-up question is, who decides what that relationship looks like? Does the startup come in saying, we want to come to you for investment or licensing or distribution? Or is that something that you guys decide? So Don, maybe we'll just keep it on you and start with you answering that question.
Sure, that's a great question. I think high level, it really depends. I think it's case by case. It really depends on what the partner is seeking in many ways. We'll do all different types or different forms of types of deals. We are open to doing deals. We're very open to working externally because external innovation is key to us. So if let's say it's a university technology, often it's going to be a licensing type of model because there is no product yet that they're selling or manufacturing or developing. This internal intellectual property that universities and small startups or companies might have can be very valuable to us for us to develop technologies internally, right? So that's and also along those lines, we can be looking at R&D collaborations with universities. So it might be very early stage. All the way up, say the next level is a startup that has a product that's on the market, and maybe it's an OEM or a product supply arrangement that perhaps want to rebrand under one of the Thermo Fisher brands. It could be that startup is looking for the breadth of the sales, marketing kind of depth that Thermo Fisher has. Maybe they want to leverage some of the brand recognition to get a bigger exposure. So if that's the situation that the startup is looking for, then we can partner in that capacity. For us, we're looking for if the technology fits our portfolio gaps, the technology really addresses a customer need and want and pain point or a workflow solution, and it makes sense for us. We're flexible. We'll approach it to where I think both parties really need, all the way up to M&A. If it's an exit point for a company, and it makes sense. I think that was generally the gist of it. Oh, you're also asking who makes those decisions.
Yeah.
I think it really depends again on what the teams need. If it's something that we can't force the other side obviously to go down a certain path, and we're really open and flexible as far as what kind of a transaction that we want to bring in, how the technology comes in.
how about you, Patrick, over at Millport Sigma? What types of ways do you guys engage? Do you have an investment arm?
Yes.
Who makes the decision?
Yeah. So we do have an investment arm. We call it M Ventures. And we work, the business works very closely with M Ventures. It's an arm's length, situation. And it's, again, to Don's point, it's whatever the startup or the company how they want to engage, right? We'll do everything from M&A all the way to license deals. The decisions around M Venture. So sometimes a company is looking for a strategic investment, right, or a level of investment in an equity position, to give an equity position. Then we would send over to them over to M Ventures, and if M Ventures has a company that is probably needs commercialization and doesn't need an equity situation, then they'll send them over to us, right? And so it's not necessarily a decision point; it's more sharing connections. But for Millipore Sigma, we're doing all kinds of transactions depending upon what the company needs, right?
Great, thanks for that, Patrick. And then over to Charlie. I know you mentioned, obviously you guys have a venture arm. Maybe you could also elaborate on, the stage of companies that you guys typically work with.
Yeah, we first of all, we love to meet companies early, even if we're not ready to invest in them. So even seed stage companies, we love to engage with, to understand, and begin building a relationship. We typically, though, are investing beginning Series A rather than seed rounds. We kind of time box if they're several years away from really launching a product. That's probably too early for us. Most on the investment side too, most of our efforts are reaching out to companies. We have a really clear idea of where we want to invest, and so when you know what you're looking for, it's relatively easy to find things. So we're more going out and finding companies rather than companies knocking on our door to pursue investments. And like with Merck Millipore, if more of a collaboration is of interest rather than an investment, our operating companies, the business development groups, are typically the appropriate entry points for various types of relationships, whether it's a commercial partnership or whether it's even co-development or R&D. Our business development groups within the operating companies are the right entry point. And that's more of a mix. Sometimes it's people knocking on our doors. It's probably more 50-50 there, with inbounds resulting in something of interest versus us going out and seeking things.
Great, thank you for that insight. One of the things that we always hear about in the programs that we run from a lot of startups is, maybe it's too early, they're not quite ready to interact with a corporate strategic. So I want to hear your thoughts on that. Is there a stage where it's too early? What kind of milestones do you look for, to progress them through partnership discussions, whatever that might be? So Charlie, maybe we'll stick with you on that one and then move down the line.
Yeah, and maybe if you just think about sort of the three different boxes, there's a research phase, there's a development stage, there's a commercial stage. And if what you're looking for is basic research and you're really trying to prove out some new science or a brand new technology, that horizon is going to be a lot longer. It's probably going to be more of a co-marketing, maybe even more of an IP relationship than other forms. And so, the timing really corresponds to what are you looking for? What are you looking for in a partner? What kind of partner? What stage of development? But I think of those things in three buckets: research, development, and commercial. Development, in my mind, is when you've got a minimal viable product and you're making the decision to go build something It may not be perfect, but you have an idea of who you're serving, a business model, but there's still a fair amount of development risk, but you're probably within 12 to 24 months of reaching the market there. And then there are commercial type partnerships where maybe you're in the late stage of beta testing or a recently launched product. Those are the different time horizons. And again, what you're looking for in each one of those deals and the milestones are early stage dependent there, but that's sort of how I think of it. I'm not sure if that provides an answer to
yeah, I mean, it sounds like, it's quite variable. I mean, it depends on, what the match is, where the company is, what you guys are looking for. Patrick, I'll go over to you. Is there a particular stage when you guys engage with companies? They may come to you with an idea. Do you push them down a certain pathway depending on what they have?
Right. So yes, I mean, we'll engage at all stages. Certainly, if the company needs help in co-development, right? So they're early stage and they need, or productization, right? They have a prototype, that's great. And then we can talk about, how to get that into manufacturing. And then usually, there'll be a sales and distribution, arm, a portion of that agreement, right? To get them, all the way to commercialization. If they're already in commercialization stage, then obviously, unless they want to take the technology into other areas, sometimes we explore that, for other applications of the existing technology. A lot of times, startups have a technology platform, and rightly so, the board's asking them, hey, focus on that and get that, get it to market. But, the platform may have other applications, and then we'll engage in co-development of those other, of the other applications. So yeah, early is great. But sometimes a company is already on the market and they just need access to other aspects of the market, other geographies, for example. And then we'll engage, that way. But it's a different type of agreement and different type of transaction.
Of course. And then Don, over to you. A question I have is, is there, when they enter the Thermo Fisher scientific discussion, is there any advantages to, going through the business development side versus, the R&D? Does it matter who they talk to? Will they eventually find their way to the right person?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the entry points can vary. We do, like, the biz dev team does receive, direct contact from some companies. But also we have our R&D teams who are often out at conferences and chatting with, different researchers and different companies at that point too. So R&D can be a good entry point as well. As the others have said, we engage pretty much at all different stages of development. So we're open to all that. And sometimes it can be more of an early stage technical discussion. And that could be, an entry point from R&D. For us, generally, we prefer to engage when there's at least some kind of proof of concept. And it's not just a concept, just generally. If it is super early stage, it doesn't mean that we don't want to engage necessarily, but it could be in some ways that we have a dialogue. We may have discussions with them as far as, if they get to a certain milestone, maybe come back and talk to us, and we kind of align on some areas in their development plan that might be meaningful for both the startup on their own plan, but then also align with some of the areas that we think are important. And that kind of feedback to the startup, I think, can be valuable, regardless if they decide to come back to us. They may go to our competitors, but often the competitor is also looking for the same kind of data point or whatnot. So to your question earlier, yeah, at some point it'll funnel to the right person, and the biz dev team will get involved when we have to start discussing, like, what does that contractual relationship kind of look like? How does the relationship, how are we going to map it out? And high level, just trying to understand the general different terms of how we can work together, and then trying to solidify that into a written arrangement. But it all starts, I think, first is really just that relationship, getting to know the person, getting to know the company, getting to know the technology. And if all that makes good sense, then we can continue to bring in the appropriate team from there.
That's great. And I think, you guys have all kind of touched on the idea of IP. I think a lot of times the feedback we hear from a company, especially early stages, they're afraid that their ideas going to be stolen by strategic who has a lot more resources to execute. But in practice, that doesn't happen, quite that often at all. And so, what kind of safeguards are there in place? Do you guys sign NDAs with your companies? Do you work out IP terms ahead of time when you're talking about those co-development relationships? So Patrick, we can jump back to you on that question.
Yeah, certainly we work out the co-development, the IP and co-development is always called out in that. And it's, in general, it's fair, right? It's if we're co-developing, then we co-own the technology. And, during the negotiations, the startup company might, start to think about, the patent, like who files for the patents and has all that maintenance costs, right, associated with it, because it can get kind of expensive, right, in sort of the patent strategy. So that's should be discussed. Obviously, in general, we do sign NDAs. Personally, I don't think that that's the next the first step, right, in developing a relationship. I like to have those conversations with the company and start to develop the relationship and an understanding of where they want to go. And I think you can do that without divulging confidential information, right? And then at that point, if you want to go, if everybody wants to go further, then an NDA might be appropriate. But ultimately, once you start to go down the path of term sheets and things like that, you probably already have an NDA in place. Yeah,
that's right. And Don, I mean, thinking back to other parts of your career when you were in tech transfer licensing, what are your approach with IP, NDAs, and protecting, ideas?
Yeah. Thanks for the question. It's a good one. I agree a lot with what Patrick was saying. Is part of our role, I think, is initially just building that relationship, and we start off as much as we can non-confidentially. So I tend not to throw a CDA out there first unless I really need to for some reason. Often it's actually the other party coming to me that feels like they want to get to the next level of disclosing something confidential. I think that first fit, is the general technology space that you want to bring to us, is that going to fill one of our gaps? Is it important to our portfolio? Those types of questions and the capabilities, and if there's a published IP, if there's a patent application out there we can review, as much non-confidential information we can look at first. Data that they might be presenting at a conference, publications, and so forth. That just makes it so much easier for us. Also internally, because if they send us something confidential, then I got to make sure that anyone who's reviewing it understands it's confidential and keeps it confidential. It's just another requirement that we have to be mindful of. So I think it's easy in the very beginning to keep things non-confidential, and then you move to the CDA when appropriate, and definitely go forward on that. I feel like when you say, like, from my past history working with small startups and licensing and so forth, I think part of it is you're balancing the timing of when you file for patent protection and when patents get published and things like that. Because once the published is patent, there's another level of disclosure that's out there in the public domain. But generally speaking, most companies, they'll have a patent application at least already filed. And to be honest, we're not looking to break patents or challenge people necessarily. That's not what we're companies. We'd rather they had strong patent protection, because often we're looking for an exclusive license, right? And if they have, strong IP, really strong claims, then that's ultimately going to keep, the competitors away if we do a transaction with that particular company. So we review the intellectual property with a lens of looking to see how strong it is, right? And how much is it worth? If the stronger their IP, maybe is worth more to us. If it's weak IP, then it may be of less value. It really depends case by case. There could be other capabilities that are important, but that all goes into the mix. And then the flip side of that coin is also understanding the freedom to operate around that technology and the complexities there, which is a different question. But that is also important as we start sizing up. What does a transaction look like? If we do a deal with a specific company, they may have a great patent portfolio, but do we need to get other licenses around that? And what would that add to the cost, if those licenses are even available?
Yeah, no, sort of a follow-up question on this idea of IP and patents. Do you guys have kind of your internal or external law firms that you work with to evaluate IP? How much do you take a startup coming in and saying, we've done an FTO at face value?
Yeah, so we do have an internal IP group, separate from I mean, they're part of our legal team, but kind of separate. So that's our first point of contact, is really working with them. If we need to outsource, what they do, that has to do particularly if there's certain areas that we're focusing in on, or if there's bandwidth requirements or resource issues. But we do a lot of that actually internally. We'll start, looking at what the startup has to offer us. They should be the closest to their own technology. They should have at least a fundamental understanding of the intellectual property. They've often already engaged external counsel for that. There's been situations where, we've looked at the IP and we've found some potentially concerning IP that's out there, and we can share that with the startup and whether or not they want to, consider it or not. And we've had situations where the startup, for their own, peace of mind and security and needs, they went out and sought the license because they weren't aware of certain patents that were out there. And then, these were things that they wanted a clear understanding of. So in some ways, with that partnership idea, I think overall it came to a better IP strength for the company that we're licensing from, or actually, OEM products in from. But then also for us, that we felt more secure with where we're sourcing product and IP from.
Great. And we have a question about some agreement terms, but we'll dive into that in a little bit later. I wanted to turn over quickly to Charlie. You had mentioned that you guys kind of go out and approach companies. So when a company is, evaluating different potential strategic partners, what are some things that you advise them to look for, and how does Danaher basically compete? Do we have Charlie's audio? Okay. I don't hear Charlie. Does anyone hear him? Okay, you might have to call in Charlie. We lost your audio there. Maybe while we figure that out, we could switch over to Patrick and talk about how does a company evaluate which strategic partner to go to?
How do we evaluate which strategic partner?
The other way. So how would you advise like a startup? What should they look for in their strategic partners?
Yeah, right. So capabilities, track record, and alignment with their immediate and long-term goals, right? So again, depending upon the development phase of the company, really understanding what capabilities are missing, what are the gaps, in your startup, and how those can be filled by a strategic partner. I think that sometimes companies have aspirations that they can do, certain things all by themselves. Like manufacturing instruments and things like that, or, going to go to market, and ramping up a sales force in a commercial organization. But really taking a hard look at, your capabilities and then, looking at strategic partners that will fill those gaps that you have.
Great. Don, is there anything you wanted to add about advice, I guess, for startups when they're evaluating potential strategic partners?
No, I think Patrick made some really good comments there. It's really understanding, first off, the startups, their business plan, their plan, what are they looking to do? And then trying to see if that strategic partner really has that capability, skill set to really drive them to where they want to go to.
Great. And so we have a few questions that kind of dive into, the nitty gritty of some of these agreements. One of the questions that we got through the chat, when negotiating an NRE based project, how is exclusivity dealt with? You know, is it generally the case that the sponsoring company expects exclusive rights? Patrick, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yes. You know, our hope and desire is for exclusivity, right? And to not have it be overly complicated. Yeah.
How about over at Thermo Fisher, Don, any differences there?
In relation to need for exclusivity?
Yes.
It's definitely our preference. I mean, if it depends on the nature of what the relationship looks like, but if there's, you know, investment of resources coming in from both sides, you know, and we're looking to try to develop something out of that, we need to be able to benefit from that rather than leveraging our competitors being able to come in.
Great. Let's see if Charlie, if we've got your audio working again over there. We can go back to you, you know, matter of exclusivity, but just generally talking about how Danaher works with startups and what they should look for when they partner. I think you're on mute. Seems like audio is not working still. Sorry, Charlie. We'll keep going. We'll keep going with this, and we'll hopefully get to some Charlie's responses when we get that audio working. So some more questions about agreements. So, you know, what are the types of rights that are reasonable for a strategic to require as part of a co-development deal? So Don, we'll start with you. I know it's kind of an open-ended question, but you know, more broadly, just talking about co-development deals and what kind of terms startups should look for.
Yeah, it's a good question. It varies based on the circumstances. But kind of along the lines we were talking about with exclusivity is at least trying to be able to protect the investment that we're putting into that co-development, right? I think that's one of the things that's going to be is a central theme. And along those lines too is also understanding what happens with intellectual property that comes out of that co-development. Is it jointly owned, or are some aspects of it going to be solely owned by one of the other parties? And what kind of freedom to operate is needed, I guess, between the two parties? And also trying to understand what is it that the both parties are trying to ultimately try to commercialize or monetize. Because some co-development arrangements can happen where a partner's got background IP, but we're asking them to do a co-development in an application area that perhaps is not their core focus. So they may be looking to commercialize a certain technology in a space that we have no interest, but we're really pivoting and using their background IP and their capabilities along with our capabilities to create let's say a BioTools specific application. And in that case, we might be able to come to some, you know, positive arrangement where we have exclusivity for our particular field of use, and then they could use, you know, the joint IP, if it is joint IP, in their particular field of use, and we can both coexist. So there's ways of just trying to, you know, partition the intellectual property and partition how we're going to, you know, go forward on the commercialization of the outputs. Of course, all that's very important at the get-go to go in, but I think there's ways to find that common shared solution.
We'll test Charlie's audio. Let's see if is it working now? Still not working. Sorry about that. Let's go over to Patrick. So sticking to the topic of co-development deals, you know, what are kind of terms that are reasonable for a strategic to ask for?
Right. In addition to what Don was mentioning, I think that, you know, milestones, finding milestones is reasonable. Asking to have a joint development committee, you know, that meets regularly, you know, say quarterly, for with sponsors, you know, to see how the progress is going. Those are some of the other things that, you know, could be worked into the agreement, would be reasonable.
I totally agree with that comment too that Patrick just made, especially with the milestones. We tend to also try to, say, gauge progress with milestone payments and so forth as far as how we progress that co-development. So that way, both parties, I think, benefit. If it's not working, let's have an easy way to unwind it and not say, let's put all our eggs in one basket, all the money up front, but let's both mutually, come to the table and work on it and contribute at hitting milestones. That's a really good point.
Great, and I want to see if Charlie's mic is working now.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can. Sounds good.
You can. Wow. That's awesome.
So we'll bring you back into the conversation, Charlie. Maybe backing up a little bit, talking about how startups should approach Danaher. What are things that they would look for? What kind of alignments would make it a good fit?
Yeah, I think alignment is critical, and in big companies, I think the key is it's got to be a super high priority if you're going to get traction. And you need to be also talking to the right individual. It's going to be someone who has some affiliation with the commercial organization, unless this is really early stage research, and it's okay just to do sort of a research stage type of agreement, and then maybe that's part of the R&D organization exclusively. But it's really important to understand how important a priority is this for the company. And if it's not one of the top 1, 2, maybe 3 priorities, the likelihood of something really getting traction internally is going to be really low, even if it's, so trying to assess whether it's a nice to have or a critical priority, that will, I think, accelerate the conversation. It's really easy to get caught up in, a product manager, somebody liking an idea and trying to push a boulder up the hill, but it never really gets traction.
I had asked Don, a similar question about entry points into Danaher and who to talk to. Is there a difference between talking to the venture group versus the R&D versus business development? How does a company know who to approach?
Yeah, it's really hard. In Danaher, if you're looking for money, the investment group is the right place to come as an entry point. If it's a collaboration or a commercial agreement, approaching one of the operating companies is the place to start. And there is crosstalk. So, you might start with a collaborative conversation and, oh, by the way, we're raising money, and it's a pitch back into the Innovation Center. Typically, the way that we're working with the Innovation Center is it's a lot easier for us to do diligence on an opportunity, make an investment, and then over time, if it makes sense to form some sort of collaborative relationship, co-development, commercial agreement, whatever the case, those things take a lot longer than it takes for us to make a decision on an investment. And so, frequently in many of those, it's then turning into some sort of open innovation type relationship.
And then last question to catch you up with what we were talking about, the idea of exclusivity, is that something that Danaher pursues? How does a company, I guess, negotiate around exclusivity?
Yeah, we're always thoughtful about is exclusivity required? It really comes down to what's the strategy around that relationship. Where is it going in the long run? I've worked closely or been part of M&A for a really long time, and exclusivity is really seen as a very positive thing if your ultimate aim is to own an asset, and that can be a way to get deeply engaged and sort of control the fate of that asset better. But that's not the only way of doing things. So I think it goes back to goal alignment. What are you trying to achieve through this relationship? Everything we do doesn't necessarily need to be exclusive. And there are lots of different, I think people were bringing up other points. You can divvy up a particular technology by lots of different fields of use, geographies, by virtue of channel used and so forth. So, there are lots of different ways to get creative around structuring something that makes sense around exclusivity. But it's also something that the company should be thinking, but the entrepreneurs should be really thinking about. Do you want to tie your engine to a single horse and be beholden to them, or do you want to hedge your bets a little bit? And also, from the entrepreneur's point of view, working through big partners, particularly on a commercial end, are you going to lose that connectivity with customers? And typically, we are typically advising companies, look, you want to go direct. You want to get that firsthand customer experience and be intimate with the customer before partnering or creating channels to your ultimate target customer. So that's typically our advice.
Great, thank you, Charlie. And I want to continue, demystifying the idea of approaching a corporate strategic. One of the questions we got in the chat is, is there a good acid test to find out where your company sits on the priority list of a corporate? So, should you be looking for having VPs at that table, directors? How do you know that those conversations are going to progress in the direction you want it to? So, Charlie, maybe starting with you.
Yeah, you've got to have that conversation and really probe there. But ask the same question 3 different ways to really assess, is this really a super high priority? Make sure you're talking to decision makers higher up in the organization. Probably the clearer the answer is going to be on that. If you're starting at a product manager level in an organization, they may not be that well attuned to what is a high level priority for a very large business. If you're talking to the president or a general manager, they're probably going to have a very clear idea of what priorities are. So, if you're starting at a lower entry point, just validate that. Try to get meetings with more senior individuals, but ultimately, it's really, is this how high of a priority is this? How much pain are you experiencing, or how much interest is there? Trying to get a clearer answer.
So, Patrick, Don, I also want to turn to you. Maybe Patrick first. This question of an acid test. How do you know if you're on the high priority list? And is there mechanisms to speed up the conversation and keep negotiations going?
Right. Yeah, I think you can certainly, if you have higher, level people in the organization around the table, that's a really good sign. And if they keep around the table, that's an even better sign. But you can ask the company, what are your strategic priorities, in this space, and they may or may not tell you. But then you can also ask, what is it about my company that's attractive, right? And and if you get a straightforward answer, especially if you're have VPs around the table or business development directors, you might get some information there. To speed up the process, it's actually we run a stage gate process, for business development deals, and you want to, again, you can see how transparent the company is. Where are we in your process, right? Are we just in the front end funnel, or are we being prioritized? That sort of thing. You might not get an answer, or you might get an answer. But getting through the process, there's a lot of different steps, and I know that it can be frustrating for small companies to go through all those steps. It's not just necessarily approvals, but every time, and certainly if the agreement gets overly complicated, the term sheets are exclusivity in this geography but not in that geography, and all this all the complicated terms that you can come up with, then it could start to slow it down as well.
Yeah, and I think as a follow-up question, what are some kind of signals or signs that show that a strategic really is interested beyond, asking the straightforward questions? Is it, who's at the table? Is it how quickly these conversations are happening? How often? What are some signs over at Millipore that indicate you guys are really interested?
Well, that that the business development person is is gaining alignment internally, right? So, the business is coming to the table, R&D is coming to the table, all the different functions that are required. If it's a manufacturing agreement, that, the manufacturing team's coming to the table, and as opposed to just a one-on-one conversation with business development. When that you're progressing, when you have, based on what the outcome in the agreement is being contemplated, that you have multiple people engaged in the organization. The business development folks, they want to do deals, so and part of their role is to triangulate, between the internal. I mean, sometimes it's just as much to sell it to internal stakeholders as it is to manage the partner that you're dealing with, right? And so getting that stakeholder alignment is paramount, right? And when you start to see that happening, then you're in a good place.
That's great advice, Patrick. And then over to you, Don. So similar question, what are some signs that things are progressing in the right direction for a startup over at Thermo Fisher?
Yeah, thanks again. That's a great question. As far as priorities on the first part, I think if we contact you, then it's generally going to be a high priority. So, everyone's got busy day jobs. So when we go out there and we're tapping you on the shoulder, then yeah, we've made this event, a priority for us. On the converse, I really have to agree with Charlie and Patrick, what they were saying. I think two high level litmus tests would be like who's at the table as far as the seniority level. If the more senior you go, usually those people have less bandwidth to get onto a call, so they tend to be joining if it's a high priority or interest level. And then I really agree with what Patrick was just finishing off on, was that internal stakeholder alignment. That is a critical piece. And the two other players that I tend to bring in on important deals early on will be the technical R&D team, and then also the product development team. And when we triangulate on a call with a potential partner, it's usually because people are pretty serious. And trying to get that team together, sometimes, honestly, it may take some time. So I wouldn't want to discourage people by saying, oh, how come our call is a week out or something like that? If it's a high priority, we would be having it tomorrow. To be honest, it can be a high priority, but there's other high priorities going on for that particular team. Because as you start broadening the team, you can't move as fast. So sometimes there's this sincere priority. It's just that R&D teams on conference, my product management teams, on another visit somewhere or something. So when you get those folks all around the table, and we're asking and really pressing, I guess, especially in the data area, to make sure how robust is the technology, I think there's a good sense that there's traction. And we talked about this a little bit earlier before, is if we move from a non-confidential to a confidential conversation, that's an indicator that, hey, we actually want to execute a CDA to get some more information. We realize it's sensitive to the startup, so let's go ahead and do the CDA. And then I think the next early gate for us is we tend to like to evaluate the product somehow in-house. So if we're asking for an internal evaluation, then that's pretty important too, because what that means on our side is we're actually carving out and dedicating R&D resource time to do an evaluation. Sometimes, it could be a product already in the market. We might have bought some of the reagent and started testing as well internally, because we're just so anxious and so interested in seeing how it performs in our own hands. So the first thing is really, we trust the startup, give us some data, show us how good it really works, convince us it's as good as the gold standard. And then ultimately that we want to see how it really performs in our hands. Not just performance, but also, is it kludgy? Is it easy to work with? And does it perform, but is it also just easy as a workflow?
Those are all really great points. We had another question that came up. So Charlie, I'll point this to you. If you can, share with us, about a specific life science tool deal that your company has done, and, your role and how it happened and the result.
Over my career, I've done a whole lot. The last 4 years have been really more on the investment side, but we have seen some of the investments then turn into open innovation type opportunities, whether it's co-development or around or around channel partnerships. I guess the most common form of agreement resulting from the investments we're making are more commercial agreements where, whether it's co-marketing or whether it's a distribution relationship. And we've done a few of those with an investment and then culminated in a geography-specific channel partnership where we were selling an instrument from a company that we have invested in. And the results honestly vary. It comes down to ultimately, how robust that product is in the first place, and then how high of a priority it is for an operating company, and just how close of a fit there is with that different product and the sales force that would now take on the responsibility to sell that product. And we often when we're thinking about synergies, it's like, oh, well, we're talking to the same call point. And even if you're talking to the same call point, if the technology is completely different, there's quite a lot of training that may need to go on. And you need to be cognizant of, well, is the sales force used to selling at this price point? How complex of a sale is it? Are you really selling to the same individual? Is the call point really the same, or is the buyer and user very different? Particularly the user, it may all come together at a director, but these technologies may be used by completely different users in a same lab. And so, understanding some of those distinctions up front can maybe help with some missteps in terms of presuming that just adding another product into a bag that goes into the alleged same call point, you need to be really careful. And so the ones that were better matched in terms of the selling price, the degree of complexity, that not just the same call point, but similar user or using a workflow with a common user, those types of product and channel partnerships generally are a lot more successful than platforms that are separated widely by price point, by users, even if it's going to the same quote unquote customer. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. I guess kind of the message is to kind of keep it simple in some ways. So, Patrick, Don, do you guys have any specific case studies? Patrick, starting with you, of a deal that you were part of and the result there.
Yeah. I've done a lot of deals, but one that might be of interest, it was somewhat of a complex deal, but I think it was really good. There was a company that had a technology, it had an instrument in the market and was marketing into the diagnostic space. And we engaged with the company to access the technology in the research space. Now, the instrument that they had was geared towards automation, but the internal, aspect of the instrument, the internal engine, was, if we just reskinned it, we could put it into, a research market. We have assay development, kit development capabilities. So we accessed the technology, entered into an agreement for exclusive research rights with a co-development of the instrument for research. And we developed kits for that instrument and then commercialized it. And so that's an example of where a company had a particular application that they were going after, but understood that the technology could be monetized even more if it went into other markets. And so we took it into to the research market. And another aspect of that was if there was a researcher that, in clinical research was looking to, go into diagnostics, that we would transfer, and there were all kinds of clauses, that we would transfer that customer back over to them. So that's an example.
No, that was great. Thank you, Patrick. Don, over to you. A case study about, a deal that you were involved in, and what was the result there?
Yeah, it's hard to kind of think through which one to use as a case example. I guess one of the deals that that I was working, it started out as what we thought would be a straight OEM in finished good kind of transaction. they had a product, well, it was probably beyond prototype. They had a product that was really early stage on the market, and customers were using it, buying it, and so forth. And we took it in and we evaluated it. We actually took it in initially under the same kind of early adopter type of evaluation arrangement and tested it, and we liked it. So we did the transaction as a type of a supply arrangement in parallel with continuing our own evaluation of the technology, because we wanted to try to move quickly, and went early stage on the technology. And as you can appreciate, in some cases, startups, their level of specification requirements, not only in the product output, but also in the manufacturing process and so forth, sometimes could be less than, let's say, a larger company may require. In part, not because they're really asking for a superior product, but part of it has to do with, the voice of customer that we've received of what's going to be the minimum requirements. And then plus, a company such as ours has a reputation in the marketplace that we have an opportunity to lose our reputation. Whereas a startup, often they're not really known yet. So they're throwing or selling products out there that are just good enough, and they need feedback, right? So they're trying to get feedback from the market still. Products can be failing and so forth. So in this situation, and when we brought the product in, we started really running it in under the microscope for us to, details of what we needed. There were some changes that needed to be made, modifications that needed to be made to the product. And during that course, we had a good relationship with the startup because they were willing to make those changes, because in order for the product to be viable, they had to make these changes. So we collaborated and worked together. It kind of turned into almost like a co-development relationship without a co-development necessarily agreement in place, because we had more of a supply agreement in place. But that kind of shows how trust with a good partner, we can get to a viable product without having to go through another round of legal documentation of saying, hey, let's pause and step back, do a co-development. Hey, we have a certain understanding, let's work together. We have a shared vision and output. This is where we want to get to. So we were able to move the product forward and ultimately launch that. I think there's also some conversations that was mentioned before about, internal stakeholder alignment. So that was another part of what business development has to do sometimes, is really spend a bit of time trying to really bring in the right teams then, because as it pivoted to more of a co-development relationship initially, the quality teams had to be more engaged. The regulatory teams, and R&D obviously had to be more engaged. Not that we were making the changes ourselves, but we wanted to make sure we were reviewing and evaluating those changes that were going to be made to make the product to the standard that we thought was required. But that was added resources. And then there's the added pressure internally saying, okay, we had a certain return on this product, and now you're investing more into it, and trying to get that stakeholder alignment too, of saying, hey, we still have trust in the product, which is worth the additional investment, and have that conversation both internally, but also with our partner. So I think ultimately it's that flexibility and understanding if you have a good partner and trust to get that product out the door, which we did ultimately.
Right. I think that's, kind of been a common thread is really having that open dialogue and like you said, trust in a good partner that's key to these conversations. I guess kind of one of the last closing questions, we've talked about like ongoing discussions, how to start them, but what about when they end? So when does a company take no for an answer? Or do they is there ever, like you say for certain this is no, or is it not right now? So how does a company know that it's over? And also, as a strategic, if a company says that they have other conversations going, does that scare you off? Does it create urgency? So a couple points on that question. Don, we'll keep with you and then go down the line.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think for me, I think it's important to be as open and transparent as possible to your partner or with your partner. And what I really mean by that is if we can make a quick decision that's a no-go, then I like to try to let them know as quickly as possible that the relationship at this point, because things change, because our strategy may change, our plans may change, they may continue to develop their product and they may be hitting different points. We may part at a point of saying, hey, you had 2 arms on it, we need 5 arms on it or whatever, right? And they might be working towards that so that we can come back again. But I think, time is precious to everyone. Including the startups, especially if they're running on borrowed or short cash runs and so forth. So they will know, or they should know exactly where we stand. I think, from that point. But there is opportunities, I think, to always circle back and come back if things do change in the future.
But over to you, Patrick. Similar question.
Yeah, I agree with Don. You know, it's great to be transparent, and we'll say no when it, you know, and it's usually no, but you know, so come back or let's have a conversation once, you know, these milestones are met, or if something changes internally. Yeah.
And Charlie.
Yeah, not too much to add. I think really well aligned there. You know, we like to be fully transparent, including giving clear guidance in terms of, you know, what are those milestones or triggers to revisit. And, you know, if there is still some interest, but it's just too early, you know, we'll set a date together with, again, clarity. You know, here's what we're looking for, and if you reach these, you know, feel free to come back to us. I think that's sort of our standard of care for conversations.
Yeah, that's fair. So it seems like usually it's a no but or a come back later for many of these conversations. But I think there are probably times where, you know, a company has made such a critical mistake that it really is a no. And so I'm curious, you know, starting with you, Charlie, you know, what's kind of common pitfalls that you advise startups to look out for that could really tank, you know, any hopes they have?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm trying to think of examples. I mean, it usually comes down to trust. Do we trust these guys as a partner? And was there something that led to mistrust? It could be misrepresentation. It could be overselling, under delivering, you know, a combination of factors. But, you know, the first element where you could trip up is just around trust. I think there are other things that could just be sort of mechanical things that it could be in the way. You know, IP is one where, you know, they may have a blind spot on IP or a presumption around the IP. You know, we often hear, you know, we think we have freedom to operate. We're aware of some IP that's out there, but we think it's invalid. And when we hear that, that's usually raising up some red flags. You know, if there are existing patents out there until they're litigated, you know, you presume that they're valid. But we frequently hear that argument, and that could be another pitfall if people are just overconfident in an IP position, where we know that there's some potential landmines. And maybe the last thing is simply around, you know, credibility of a team around the market potential, or just having clarity around what is the problem that you're solving. So these are some of the common pitfalls that we see. Magical thinking around the scale of the opportunity and the problems that are being solved by the particular technology. You know, that means that you're just never going to align on value, and so, you know, even if there's interest there, the likelihood of being able to align on something like value is pretty low.
Oh, great tips. So Don and Patrick, I also want to give you guys a chance to weigh in. So maybe Don first. Common pitfalls that you see, think companies should avoid.
No, I think Charlie did a great job there, really summarizing the key points. I don't really have much to add. I call out a couple things in particular. I think that the broken trust is probably critical. I tend to feel as though you're doing transaction and deals with people. You know, the companies are obviously involved, but if you don't have that trust that those people are representing the company and what they, you know, what you're going to do the deal on, it doesn't get better, right? As the deal goes forward. If the trust is already broken and, you know, shaky grounds, it has to be a really valuable asset of some sort to really, I guess, to come back and want to work with that team if they've broken that. The intellectual property can be another trigger point, that if either their IP doesn't really hold up to the product, it doesn't cover the product that they're really trying to sell, so it doesn't allow us to have that protection in the marketplace either, then that transaction becomes a lot less attractive. Or if the competitors can just kind of build around them, then unless they have some kind of capability other than IP, that could be I guess, a challenging point to get over, I guess, at times. I think those are probably the main ones, but I think that was covered by Charlie as well.
I know that was helpful. And Patrick, you get the last word. So either common pitfalls or just some general advice you want to share with our startups.
In addition to Charlie and Don, what they said, which I fully agree with, sometimes I see, crazy numbers, right? Recognize that if it's important to us, we have a lot of market research and we've modeled, this business out. So, hockey sticks that lead to, insane, valuations, is a very much a common pitfall, right? And not understanding, the full, the timelines in building these cases. The other thing is, just general advice. Make sure you build a very strong, relationship with the business development partner in our organization, right? They're going to be your internal champion. So be very collaborative and develop that relationship and take the time to develop that relationship. And it's not that the business development person serves the small startup company. It should be a collaboration.
Excellent. Well, thank you all to our panelists. That was some incredible insight and advice. So we're going to end the YouTube live streaming here, but stick around and for our cohort.